The Thanksgiving dinner in Portland this year did not conclude with the warmth of family gratitude, but rather disintegrated into a chaotic scene of pure greed and deafening screams that shattered the evening peace. I am Nadine, a 35-year-old woman who has spent over a decade building a life in Seattle far away from the suffocating shadows of my childhood home. Everything seemed typical until my sister suddenly lunged across the mahogany table while gripping my unlocked phone with trembling hands and shrieked that I was a liar for hiding $15 million from the people who raised me. My father slammed his fist so hard against the table that the silverware rattled while my mother stared at me with a coldness I had never seen before, as she demanded that I transfer half of that fortune to my sister immediately. They claimed that my sister deserved the money more because she had stayed behind to support them while I was busy being selfish in another city. But they had no idea where that money actually came from, or the sacrifices I made to earn it. Before we dive into the details of how my secret was exposed, and why I decided to walk away from my family forever, I need your help to keep this channel alive. We have noticed that our reach is dropping lately, so subscribing is the best way you can support our work while allowing us to continue sharing these intense real-life stories with you. It is completely free and only takes a second of your time, yet it means the world to our small team. Also, before I continue, please let me know in the comments what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see just how far my story has traveled across the world today. Now let us begin the story. The injustice in our household was never a secret, but rather a heavy rule that dictated every interaction since the moment Roxanne decided the world revolved around her whims. I remember a specific winter evening during high school when she took my hard-earned savings from a summer job to buy a designer handbag she could not afford. Yet, Victoria simply told me to be more generous because my sister had a delicate social standing to maintain. When Roxanne accidentally crashed the family SUV into a neighbor's fence while driving without a license, Arthur spent 3 hours screaming at me for leaving the keys on the kitchen counter instead of holding her accountable for her own recklessness. I was the one who walked 4 miles to my part-time job at the local library in the pouring rain, while Roxanne lounged on the sofa complaining about the quality of the premium cable channels my parents struggled to pay for. My academic achievements were treated as minor inconveniences that distracted from the constant drama of her failing grades and frequent social scandals that required my parents to deplete their modest retirement fund just to keep her out of legal trouble. Victoria would often look at me with a weary expression and explain that because I was the strong one, I did not need the same level of support or affection that her precious Roxanne required to survive. This pattern of emotional neglect forced me to become my own advocate very early in life, because I realized that if I did not fight for my own future, I would be sacrificed to fuel my sister's insatiable need for attention. During my senior year, I stayed up until 3 in the morning finishing my scholarship applications by candlelight, because Dad refused to pay the electricity bill after Roxanne spent the money on a weekend trip to Las Vegas with friends we did not even know. Even then, they expected me to apologize for being frustrated, claiming my negative energy was causing Roxanne to feel anxious during her nail appointments. I learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut, while meticulously planning an escape that would take me so far away they could never drag me back into their cycle of dysfunction. Every dollar I earned from tutoring and cleaning houses was hidden in a floorboard under my bed, because I knew Roxanne would steal it the moment she felt like buying another pair of shoes she would never wear. By the time I graduated, I felt like a stranger in my own home, watching 3 people live in a delusion where one child was a goddess and the other was merely an administrative assistant for their chaos. The night before I left for Seattle, I sat in the darkness of my tiny room and realized that the only way to save my sanity was to build a fortress of independence that no one in this family could ever breach with their guilt trips. They did not even notice my bags were packed until I was standing at the front door with my bus ticket in hand, and even then Victoria only asked if I could leave my winter coat behind because Roxanne liked the color. 8 years after moving to Seattle with nothing but a tattered suitcase and a fierce determination to succeed, I found myself standing at the window of a high-rise office overlooking the Puget Sound. My early days in the city were a blur of 16-hour shifts, where I balanced a secretarial job at a logistics firm during the day and a night position as a data entry clerk for a tech startup that barely had enough funding to pay its employees. I lived in a studio apartment where the heater rattled like a dying engine, and the only furniture I owned was a second-hand mattress I found on a street corner. Yet the freedom I felt was more luxurious than anything Roxanne had ever experienced. I discovered that I had a natural talent for identifying market patterns and assessing risks, which eventually caught the eye of a senior partner at a venture capital firm who decided to take a chance on a girl with no pedigree but a massive appetite for hard work. While my peers were spending their bonuses on luxury cars and expensive vacations, I lived as if I were still earning minimum wage, channeling every cent into high-risk, high-reward tech investments that most people were too afraid to touch. There were months when I survived on nothing but instant noodles and black coffee, so I could maximize my contributions to a portfolio that I hoped would one day be my ultimate safety net. My family rarely called unless Roxanne had run into another financial disaster or Victoria wanted to remind me how much they were struggling without my physical presence to handle the chores. I would listen to their complaints about the rising cost of living in Portland while I was quietly hitting milestones that would have made their heads spin, but I never breathed a word about my growing net worth. By the time I turned 30, a series of strategic bets on emerging artificial intelligence firms had paid off in a way that felt almost surreal, turning my modest savings into a staggering fortune of $15 million. I stared at my bank balance for nearly an hour in total silence, not because I was happy, but because I finally felt safe for the first time in my entire life. I hired a team of elite wealth managers to diversify my assets across global markets and real estate because I knew that money could disappear as quickly as it arrived if I was not careful. Despite my wealth, I continued to drive a 10-year-old sedan and wear clothes from discount retailers because I did not want the world to see me as a target, especially not the people back in Portland who still viewed me as the family's invisible workhorse. I watched Roxanne's life through social media as she posted photos of rented yachts and expensive dinners, always accompanied by captions about her entrepreneurial journey that was entirely funded by our parents' dwindling credit lines. It was a bizarre double life where I was a high-powered investor in one world and a struggling daughter in the other, but I preferred the anonymity because it gave me a sense of control I had never possessed as a child. 1 year before the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, my phone rang at 3 a.m. with a call from my Uncle Julian, who was the only family member who ever treated me with genuine respect. He spoke with a trembling voice as he explained that Arthur and Victoria were on the verge of losing the family home because they had co-signed a series of disastrous business loans for Roxanne's failed boutique venture. The bank was threatening foreclosure within 90 days, and my parents were too ashamed to tell me, choosing instead to sink deeper into a depression that was visible to everyone in the neighborhood. I felt a familiar surge of resentment toward Roxanne for her endless selfishness, but I could not stand the thought of my elderly parents being thrown onto the street because of her incompetence. I told Julian that I would handle the debt under the strict condition that he would never reveal the source of the funds, acting instead as a mysterious benefactor or an anonymous debt relief program. Over the next 12 months, I secretly transferred $60,000 to cover the mortgage arrears and settled an additional $100,000 of Roxanne's high-interest predatory loans that were draining my parents' bank accounts. I watched from a distance as the tension in their lives seemed to evaporate, but instead of gratitude, they began to attribute their sudden financial stability to Roxanne's supposed good luck and spiritual manifestations. Roxanne took advantage of the situation by convincing mom and dad that a secret investor had seen her potential and was providing her with a monthly allowance as a sign of her future success. During our brief monthly phone calls, Victoria would brag about how Roxanne had finally turned her life around and was now the primary provider for the household, all while I was the one working 12-hour days to authorize the transfers. It was infuriating to hear Dad praise Roxanne for her financial wisdom, while he simultaneously criticized me for being too stingy to buy them a new television for Christmas. I began to realize that my anonymity was actually fueling the very delusion that had made my childhood so miserable, but I was too deep into the arrangement to stop without causing a total collapse. Julian often pulled me aside during my rare visits to tell me that I was a saint, but I felt more like a fool who was paying for the privilege of being insulted by the people I was saving. Every time Roxanne posted a photo of a new designer watch or a weekend getaway to a luxury spa, I knew that my money was indirectly funding her lifestyle while she claimed to be a self-made woman. I saw her manipulative behavior reaching new heights as she convinced our parents that I was probably jealous of her success, which led to even more coldness during our interactions. Even Oscar warned me that this secret would eventually explode, reminding me that people like Roxanne do not stop until they have taken everything, but I thought I could manage the situation indefinitely. I believed that as long as the house was safe and my parents were comfortable, I could handle being the villain in their story if it meant keeping the peace. What I did not account for was the sheer audacity of a person who has never been told no, and how far Roxanne was willing to go to maintain her fake image of wealth. Exactly at 6 o'clock on that fateful Thanksgiving evening, the air in the dining room became stifling as Roxanne began her usual routine of belittling my career choices in front of our extended family. She was wearing an outfit that probably cost more than my first car, and she spent 20 minutes describing her plans to expand her consulting firm into the European market, a complete lie that Mom and Dad swallowed without question. I had spent the entire afternoon helping Victoria in the kitchen, while Roxanne sat in the living room taking selfies, yet I was the one Dad criticized for not being attentive enough to the family needs. During the main course, Roxanne asked if she could borrow my phone to take a high-quality group photo, claiming her own camera was acting up because of a recent software update. I handed it over without thinking, forgetting that I had just received a notification from my Swiss wealth management app regarding a massive quarterly dividend deposit. A few minutes later, the clinking of silverware stopped abruptly as Roxanne's face turned from a smug smile to a mask of sheer, unadulterated shock as she stared at the screen. She stood up so quickly that her chair tumbled backward, and she pointed the phone at me like a smoking gun, while screaming that I was a disgusting traitor for hiding $15 million from my own family. The room went silent for what felt like an eternity before Dad stood up, his face turning a deep shade of purple as he demanded to know if what Roxanne was saying was true. I tried to reach for my phone, but Roxanne pulled it away, shrieking the exact balance to the entire room and accusing me of letting them suffer while I hoarded wealth like a criminal. Victoria started to cry out of a twisted sense of betrayal, asking how I could be so cruel to keep such a secret from my own flesh and blood. Arthur then stood up, his voice trembling with a mixture of greed and feigned authority, declaring that according to family tradition, the most successful child must carry the weight of the others without question. He looked me in the eye and said that my refusal to pay for Roxanne's mistakes was equivalent to a crime against my own heritage. Within seconds, the conversation shifted to a coordinated attack as Roxanne demanded that I transfer $10 million to her immediately so she could fix her business and secure the family's future. Dad slammed his hand on the table and told me that as the head of the family, he was ordering me to share my fortune because I clearly did not need that much money to live my boring life in Seattle. Roxanne looked at the guests and cried about how she had sacrificed her prime years to stay in Portland, while I was a greedy corporate shark who had clearly stepped on people to get where I was. I felt a coldness settle in my chest as I realized that none of them were asking how I had earned that money or if I was okay. They were only calculating how much they could extract from me. Mom grabbed my arm and whispered that if I truly loved them, I would do the right thing and give Roxanne what she deserved, so we could finally be a real family again. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine and set the glass down with a precision that seemed to unnerve everyone in the room before I stood up to face the wolves I had been feeding. The noise died down as I looked directly at Arthur, whose hand was still trembling with a mix of anger and greed, and I told him that he should be very careful about the words he chose next. I pulled my phone back from Roxanne's grasp with a force that made her stumble, and then I called Julian, putting him on speakerphone for everyone at the table to hear clearly. I asked Julian to tell the room exactly who had been paying the mortgage for the last 12 months and who had settled the $160,000 in debt that had nearly ruined them. The silence that followed his confession was deafening as Victoria's face went pale and Dad sank back into his chair, the realization of their own ignorance finally starting to sink in. I looked at Roxanne, who was trying to stammer a lie about how she was going to pay me back, and I laughed in a way that silenced her completely. I told them that every single cent of their current comfort was provided by me, while Roxanne had been stealing from them to fund her fake lifestyle. I turned to Roxanne and asked her if she remembered the investor she had bragged about all summer, watching her face drain of color as I revealed that every dollar of that investment was actually a direct wire transfer from my personal business account. She tried to deny it, stuttering that I was manipulating the evidence, but the look of absolute shock on Dad's face proved that my words had finally cut through her web of lies. I turned to my parents and explained that I had been prepared to take care of them forever, but their immediate reaction was to demand that I hand everything over to the person who caused their problems. I told them that from this moment forward, not a single penny more would ever leave my accounts for this family, and that the bank would be hearing from my lawyers regarding the termination of my voluntary payments. Roxanne tried to scream that it was not fair, and that $15 million was enough for everyone, but I cut her off by saying that fairness had never been a priority in this house when I was the one suffering. I told Victoria that her delicate daughter was actually a financial vampire who had sucked them dry while I was the one keeping the lights on in the shadows. The guests began to whisper and cast judgmental looks at Roxanne, who was now sobbing hysterically and accusing me of trying to destroy her reputation on a holiday. Arthur tried to apologize, claiming he was just surprised, but I told him that his greed had revealed a truth that could never be hidden again. Oscar stood up and walked over to me, offering his hand as a sign that it was time to leave this toxic environment behind once and for all. I told them that they could keep the house for as long as the bank allowed, but they should expect a foreclosure notice within 90 days if they did not find a way to replace my income. As I walked toward the front door, Roxanne screamed that I was a cold-hearted monster, but her words felt like a badge of honor rather than an insult. 3 months after I walked out of that house, the inevitable consequences of my family's choices began to manifest in the most brutal way possible under the laws of the state of Oregon. Since I had stopped the automatic transfers, the mortgage on the Portland property went into default almost immediately, and because Roxanne had convinced Dad to take out a second equity line for her marketing project, the debt was insurmountable. I received several frantic emails from Victoria, claiming that they were being served with eviction notices, and that Roxanne had disappeared to avoid the creditors who were now hounding my parents' doorstep. It turned out that Roxanne had been using my parents' social security numbers to open multiple high-interest credit cards, leaving them with a debt of nearly $80,000 that they had no way of paying. Arthur tried to call my office in Seattle, but I had instructed my assistant to block any communication from them, directing all inquiries to my legal counsel instead. I learned through Julian that Roxanne had eventually been spotted in Los Angeles, trying to grift her way into another social circle while my parents were forced to sell every piece of furniture they owned just to afford a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a dangerous part of town. The golden child had truly left them with nothing, proving that my warnings were not based on jealousy, but on a clear understanding of her destructive nature. Arthur sent me one final text message before I blocked his number, not to ask for forgiveness, but to blame me for the foreclosure, claiming that if I had not been so arrogant as to reveal the truth, they could have continued living in their comfortable lie. It was the final confirmation that they did not regret hurting me. They only regretted losing the financial safety net I provided. The bank eventually moved forward with a foreclosure sale, and the home I grew up in was bought by a developer who planned to tear it down and build luxury condos, a fitting end for a place that held so many hollow memories. I felt a momentary pang of sadness for the loss of the physical structure, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of justice, as I realized that they were finally experiencing the reality I had lived in for years. They had spent their lives protecting Roxanne from the consequences of her actions, and in doing so, they had ensured that those consequences would eventually destroy all of them together. Victoria tried to send a letter through Oscar's office claiming she was sick and needed money for treatment, but a quick background check revealed it was just another ploy to fund Roxanne's legal defense fund after she was caught in a minor fraud scheme. I did not feel like a monster. I felt like a person who had finally stopped allowing herself to be set on fire just to keep other people warm. I spent my time focusing on my work in Seattle, expanding my portfolio, and mentoring young women who came from similar backgrounds of neglect and low expectations. Sitting today in my office in downtown Seattle, I watch the sun set over the horizon and feel a sense of profound stillness that I never thought possible during my years of struggle. My life is now filled with people who value my mind and my character, rather than the numbers in my bank account, and Oscar has become a permanent fixture in my world as both a partner and a confidant. I decided to use a portion of my wealth to establish a foundation that helps young adults leaving foster care or abusive homes to gain financial literacy and start their own businesses. It is my way of honoring the 8-year-old girl who had to hide her tutoring money under a floorboard just to survive, ensuring that others do not have to fight the same battles alone. My parents and Roxanne are now just distant echoes in my mind, a cautionary tale about what happens when greed and favoritism are allowed to poison the roots of a family. I have learned that family is not a blood contract that gives people the right to mistreat you, but a bond that must be earned through mutual respect and genuine support. If you are listening to this and you feel invisible in your own home, I want you to know that your value is not defined by their inability to see your worth. You have the power to build your own fortress, to save your own life, and to walk away from anyone who views your success as their personal property. It took me 35 years to realize that saying no to my family was the ultimate act of saying yes to myself, and I have never regretted that decision for a single second. Money can buy a lot of things, but the most valuable thing it ever bought me was the freedom to never have to listen to a lie again. My sister's discovery of my $15 million was the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced the truth into the light and broke the chains that were holding me back. I am no longer defined by the neglect of my past, but by the impact of my present and the possibilities of my future. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story and for being a part of this community where we share the raw, unfiltered truths of our lives. If this story gave you even a small spark of courage to stand up for yourself or to set a boundary that you have been afraid of, then sharing it was worth every painful memory. Please share your own experiences in the comments below, because your voice matters and your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to feel less alone. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss our upcoming stories about people who found the strength to redefine their destinies against all odds. Your support allows us to keep telling these stories with the depth and honesty they deserve, and I am truly grateful for every one of you who stayed until the very end. Life is too short to be a supporting character in someone else's drama.